It's truly an honor to be here and to have been someone that George led into his life. Like everyone here, no doubt, who he touched so much. I got to know George very well over the last 7 years when I moved back to Denver to research and report my book, which I mean to mention, everyone at Heritage Christian was so much in his heart. He talked about you guys all the time. And I've luckily got a chance to meet Bishop Dennis Leonard before his passing, and the book is actually dedicated to him because of George. I became really close to George, and he liked to call himself my spiritual advisor, which I sorely needed during a lot of the hard times I had over the course of this project. And he called me the pen, and I'm honored, like I said, to have been able to tell his story. He was so much of a symbol of so much in both Denver history, Black history, and also, I think, the power and promise of redemption. He was an activist without being political. He was an icon who was selfless. He was surrounded by death and mourning, and yet he was the most optimistic person I knew. I thought that I would tell just 3 little moments and events in his life that I know had such an imprint upon him, and also show what he overcame. George, as you know, was a social butterfly. He also seemed to somehow be destined to be at the center of things. Growing up in Northeast Denver, his family moved around a lot, seeking better rent. But as fate would have it, he happened to just live in the 1960s, just blocks away from the family of Lauren Watson, the founder of Denver's Black Panthers. George, then 9 or 10 and 67 or 68, was in the first group of youth who Lauren and his then girlfriend, Jasasamut, at the time Mary Lou, had started breakfast program, the Panthers breakfast program. And George was incredibly impacted by this to get not only fed but educated and have role models at a time when they really needed it, at a time when the rights of Black people and African Americans across the country were being trampled. One day in 1968, George arrived to see his icon himself, Lauren, in handcuffs. And these activists and others had become targets, it would turn out, because of their activism. They were targets of a government-sanctioned effort we later found out was called COINTELPRO, to undermine and eliminate Black leaders. And a generation of Black leaders were lost. And George was, after that time, his life took another trajectory, one that he's talked about, of course, very much, and which is what gave his ministry so much power. He was expelled from school and eventually turned to drugs and crime. But at age 37, after stints in prison, he had gotten out, and he talked about having another crack binge. He was addicted. He told a friend he couldn't go on. She took him to the Now Faith Christian Center in Montbello. He remembered the day exactly. It was December 5th, 1994. He was sitting in the back. He said he stank. He said he was sweating. And Pastor Leon Emerson called out to him. He said, "Come here." George didn't know what he was talking about because he said, Emerson said, "Preacher, come here." And he said, "God's about to deliver you." George went to the front. He was afraid. And he heard Pastor Emerson say, "Who in this congregation has been delivered by drugs?" And a number of people stood. "Who had been delivered by incarceration?" Another number of people stood. "Who here has been delivered by something?" By the time George knew it, the whole congregation in front of him was standing. He told me he wept. He fell on his knees and he started throwing up on the dais. He said he could feel the demons leaving his body. No doubt it was the support and acceptance of that congregation that day that helped him overcome the challenges that he faced and their acceptance of him. He never did crack again. Not long after that, he ended up picked up on a warrant and was back in jail, Building 22. And I just had a conversation this morning with Sheriff Diggins, who's going to say some words. And he actually brought this up, and I was amazed because this is one of my favorite stories of George's. Also, all of it's in the book in greater detail. But Diggins reminded me that he was there, actually, when George got back in. One of the congregants had brought him a Bible. It was a red hardback Bible that he actually carried around, no doubt, till the day he died. He wasn't supposed to have a hardback Bible in there because it could be dangerous, but a jailer that he knew, a woman jailer, Tracy Jones, saw him one day with this Bible in the cell, and he said he could tell she knew he didn't know how to read by the way he was looking at it. He was 37. She told him he could keep the Bible so long as he let her teach him to read, and she did. The first thing he ever read was Ezekiel 37. The valley of the dry bones. George said he heard God speak the lines to him. How they brought him out and set me in a valley full of bones. God said, breathe life into these bones and they will come back to life. The verse spoke to him, and it's easy to see why. What George saw and who those dry bones were his people, his community. He was on a mission from then, breathing life into all of us since. One of the first things he did was go back into the jail to preach. He called it the county in the dry bones. That was his sermon. He did it over and over, and he had people, of course, changed every time. There are some people who find what they were meant to do, and George Roberts, with his winding path, was definitely one of them. He told me always how he was never upset or depressed because he was in service, he said. And the service was to counsel and minister to people, many of whom were going through their hardest times. What he did was incredibly difficult, and yet he made it, of course, seem so easy because he was uniquely qualified. The Church Without Walls, ministering to people who had no money or no congregation. No one in Denver could possibly even come close to have preached as many gang funerals as George. His experiences got him into activism more. He did plan marches and was very involved in work his son Terrence did. He did a march called Not Another Mother's Child. He was thinking always about the forgotten people and those who needed it most. He counseled to everyone equally. He prayed for everyone, and he never let politics or petty fights be any kind of factor in his work. He is a hugely important political figure to me whose work enabled healing in the face of the most challenging problems of our time. Poverty, drug abuse, the violence we see that continues to go on among our youth. He worked in the hardest conditions, surrounded by death. And as many of us know, so many of the great things we can still hear in our heads. Come on, somebody. Can't say it like him, of course. And amen or hey man. I never knew which one it was, but it was the same. But he also said that the Bible to him, the Bible was basic instructions before leaving Earth. He always said when his time would come, he would be ready. I just want to say I love you, George. And I miss you, George. You're a remarkable person, and you changed all of us for the better.